Hello everyone, this is Kate from the Narrate team here. In this week's message, Adam talks about generosity. He challenges us to think not about the amounts we give, but about the faith that drives the gift. To step out in a more dependent way of living is to rely and trust in God instead of ourselves.
Top of the morning. How are all of you? So quick story, because I took us over last time, so I'm not supposed to tell this story, but I just can't not tell this story. So I had lunch this last week with my friend Brad, who manages the open lands here in Helena. Many of you know him, and if not, you may know that we've been really involved in the last 4 years of splitting firewoods and redistributing that from pine beetle kill, and then distributing that to people who could use assistance heating their homes. And it was all kind of born for us out of this idea that we wanted to create the type of church that mattered for the benefit of its non-members, that if we went away, even people who really are disgusted by Jesus and churches would be bummed if we went away, not because they've come to agree with us, but because they would recognize that we serve the common good. And we feel like the God of the Bible is a God who serves the common good and would call his church to do that without agenda necessarily. And that doesn't mean we're not hopeful for people to enter into relationship with Jesus, but that's... we don't define a win by that happening. We just feel like we're called to serve our community. Anyway, so I had lunch with him this week talking about whether or not we would get to do that again next year. The answer to that is yes. But one of the things he shared that I didn't know yet was that, you may have noticed that there's tons happening with regard to our open lands and all that pine beetle kill, and a lot of that is coming by way of federal grants. And that what he shared was that part of what's made the city so successful in these last few years at getting those grants has been that the firewood that those grants are helping fund remove, the dead trees that it's helping remove, that it's not just getting thrown away, but that it's actually going back to the community. And apparently a major part of what the grant issuers are looking for from communities like ours is a demonstration that the work being done with the grant money is actually stimulating local economy and serving local people. And so it's just one of those kind of neat, like, wow, so we had no idea that we said we wanted to serve everybody in Helena, whether they're a part of Narrate or not, and we thought pine beetle kills, like, that's everybody's problem. Turns out that that's been the case even more than we even realized, because it's helped our community get all these funds to help develop trails and all those different things. So thanks for those of you that are part of that, or those of you that are part of this place by the nature of your giving or whatever that looks like. Sure fun to be the kind of church that causes people to scratch their heads about, really, Jesus? Huh, wow, I didn't know he cared about that. Which we're working on a series for that this summer. We don't know what to call it yet. We're thinking about calling it bad theology. We just go like, we got terrible theology. Here's what it is. And anyway, no feedback on that? You like that title? I kind of like that. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek. Okay, so I was running trails earlier this week, and some of you that know me, of course, know that that's one of my favorite things in the whole world to do. And I was about 1.5 miles into one of my favorite trails on one of my more common routes. And the sensation kind of caught me off guard, but everything in me hated what I was doing. And I just had this moment of like, I want to quit. I want to turn 180 degrees around, and I want to not run, but walk home. Now, for me, that's foreign because, like I said, like for me, trail running is a blast. I love it. I talk too much about it. Many of you know that. And, and even then, so I'm learning from Caleb, if you're with us last week, how to think about my thinking. You guys working on that too? And so because I'm working on what I'm thinking, I started to go like, why? This is weird. Why? Because I love this. I mean, if you just asked me a few days prior to this, what are my favorite things in the world? I would have said reading and trail running and sex. That's fun. I like that. With my wife. I mean, it's too awkward for all of you. You don't like that? I know that most of you agree. And anyway, okay. So what's going on here? Like, why am I hating this? And then I began to recount, and I went, my routine has been broken because the 3 days prior, I hadn't ran. I ran on Friday and loved running on Friday. And then on Saturday, I had a niece graduating from high school in Billings, which is why I was gone last weekend, been working on being gone that weekend for about a year. So we went to Billings, didn't get to run that day. Not that atypical. I don't like to run Saturdays because then I'm like up here on Sundays. So not that big a deal. Didn't run Sunday, never run Sundays. But then Monday we were still in Billings and hadn't spent any time. You know how like you go and visit your parents or your family or whatever, and you spend lots of time in big groups and you don't ever get the conversation with your dad or whatever. So knew we had a couple-hour window in the morning to do that, and then we had to hurry our way back to Helena for baseball, and so decided I'd skip my morning run and hang out. Besides, it was Billings. It's like, what am I going to do? Go run down asphalt trails down the road forever, and the sun's going to beat on me. And so it just wasn't all that. I loved it there. And then I'm like, someone asked me this morning, are you doing the Governor's Cup? And I'm like, well, it's a great event, but I can go run that stuff for free. No, I'm not. Sorry if I'm getting kind of political here, aren't I? This is not good. Anyway, So I didn't run Monday. And then it hit me as I was running. Wow, I get lazy really fast. I mean, I was really only one day, you could say 3 days out of my kind of workout routine, out of this routine that for me is one of the healthiest, one of the most important things I do between me and God and me and my work. I wouldn't even know how to do my job if it wasn't for running and the time, the thoughts that I get there. And here I was, it's just a few days removed from my routine, hating it. And immediately it struck me like, oh yeah. So we started this series at Narrate last weekend, and that's what it was created from. Like, that's why we're doing it, is because we recognize that, like, have you noticed how quickly you get lazy? I ran into my friend David, like 2 miles later, who I run with, and we go on these crazy long runs on Mondays, and I ran into him, but he was walking with a friend and like had a collared shirt on and things, and he came up to give me a hug. It's like, no, we don't hug. Like, I've been running for 4 miles. And he said, how's it going? And I said, horrible. I hate this. Why did I ever think trail running is so fun? Just a few days removed from routine. Do you notice that about yourself? That like the natural propensity of the human condition is to move south? That you don't drift into like higher levels of self-discipline. You don't drift into a better marriage. You don't drift into like having more organized finances. You don't drift into being out of credit card debt. You don't drift into higher levels of godliness. Like, no. You drift into the opposite of all those things. But to arrive at these destinations that are worthwhile, it takes courage, doesn't it? It requires driving a stake in the ground. My friend Johnny told me this morning, I've been sober for 20 years now. You don't drift into being sober for 20 years, do you? You make a decision. And that's what we're talking about in this series, because we recognize, listen, we love summer, love summer. In fact, part of our culture around here is we go, hey, no guilt, like go camping. Don't feel like you have to come to church on Sunday. I mean, we're not going to let down. We're going to work just as hard. We're going to create experiences that we think you'll enjoy if you are in town. But if you miss a few weekends because you've been camping, like there won't be a sign on the sidewalk that says God hates you. Like we won't do that. Like just do your thing. And yet I think it's also important and appropriate that in June we would start a conversation called Drift, don't you? Because if we're not careful, in the process of summer, in the process of life, like all the work you've done since Easter, all the work you've done since Christmas, all the progress you've made, whether it's emotionally or relationally in your business and your finances and your physical health, all of that can get undone almost instantly, can it? And so what we've done is we've just taken a bunch of loosely connected topics that we think we're all very prone to drift in those topics. And we're just going to, through the month of June, kind of talk through this stuff. And listen, even if one of these specific topics doesn't help, I hope for you this provokes you to think about, how am I drifting? How am I thinking that past success will just naturally translate to future success, when in fact what I'm doing is I'm just drifting? So this morning, we're going to talk about generosity. And I'm going to close my eyes and everyone's going to leave who doesn't want to talk about generosity, right? Listen, I don't necessarily like talking about this, but here's the good news. We're not talking about giving this morning. No budget shortfall. That's thanks to a lot of really great people around here. No capital campaign. That's not what this is about this weekend. We're talking about generosity. And here's why. I don't like to talk about generosity, but it would be hard for me to find a topic that translates more into people's marriages and lives based upon my experience. I'm convinced that to have my role and to lead this place and not talk about generosity would be malpractice at its worst. And so this morning we're going to delve into this topic of generosity from a very like God-following perspective. So listen, if you're here this morning and you don't follow Jesus, you're not a God follower, you're not really sure what to do, or you're sure that you don't want to follow him, you're here with him or you're here with her or whatever, listen, we work so hard to create experiences with you in mind. A high percentage of who we're about. For us, one of the major wins, one of the 2 wins for us as a community is that people like you who don't like church, which is lots of us, even if we do follow Jesus, but people like you would come and you would enjoy the experience and leave challenged and provoked. So listen, please understand, everything we do, almost everything we do is with you in mind. But this morning, the message is kind of not for you. What I mean is like, get out your junior mints and like, you just get to observe. Seinfeld reference, anybody? Anybody? Junior mints, surgery. I wanted to hand everybody, I couldn't figure out how to not humiliate those of you that don't follow Jesus by giving you a box of junior mints this morning, because I'd have loved to have done that, because I would convey, like, I think you just get to sit back. I think you get to sit back and analyze not how Christians live, but how they're called to live. I think you get to sit back and hopefully get a little bit clearer insight between like how your neighbor lived or how your parents lived or how that teacher who claimed to follow Jesus lived and the way God calls us to live. I think this morning what we can do is elevate the topic from this intellectual, cerebral, like we put bumper stickers on our car and we check boxes on our thing and we don't live any different, to like what's the everyday, real life, practical decision-making process of a God follower. And for those of you that are God followers, you do, in fact, follow Jesus. My hope for you this morning is to just kind of put a gauge next to you. And I don't mean that in any kind of shaming, bony finger in your chest kind of way, but listen, I can't think of a topic where I'm more prone to drifting than generosity. And so I guess my hope this morning, I'm indebted to Bill Hybels and some thoughts that he had on this topic and some passages he pointed to just kind of cause us to reflect like where we were and where we are and where we want to be, and kind of just an audit. And to do that, I don't want to give you a definition. What I want to do is tell 3 stories, all from the Bible, 2 from the Old Testament and 1 from the New. And rather than give a definition of generosity, give a definition via narrative, via story. So the first of those stories is about a widow woman. You find her in the Old Testament. You find her in 1 Kings. Yeah, we're going to skip that 1 Timothy one. She had a son. Her son wasn't old enough to work, and so here's a woman living in a culture where women didn't have very many occupational options if they didn't have a husband. Her son couldn't feed her, and to make things worse, the economy was wrecked. There was a severe famine in the land. Whatever food was available was way more expensive than a widow woman could ever afford to purchase. And so she did what lots of people in these situations did. She had to kind of live on less and less and less and less. And yet still, some of you can relate to this, when you send off that last bit of money to pay that last bill and finally things are gone. And she reached the point where she had just a little bit of flour left. Just a little bit of oil, just enough to make one more loaf of bread. And she had made the decision, she had made the decision that she was going to make one more loaf of bread, and then her and her son were going to go off in the corner of the house, and they were going to die. And yet simultaneously, down the road a ways, you might say, was a well-known prophet. His name was Elijah. But Elijah was a little depressed. He was a little down on his luck. He'd been powerfully used by God in the past, but not so much lately. He too was affected by the famine. And God did the most interesting thing. He said to Elijah, hey, Elijah, I want you to get up from here, and I want you to go knock on the door of that widow's house, and I want you to move in with her. Like, not like become a couple, but I want you to, like, she's going to take care of you. And so he does. He shows up at the door. He knocks on her door. He shows up at the door. He knocks on the door. She answers the door. And she says, hey, God told me to move in with you. And I have to think that she's going, well, that's great. I'm going to be dead in a couple of days. You can have the place then. And then he says, it gets even, like for those of you males that are going like, this is backwards. This is like able-bodied men looking to a single mom to take care of him. It gets even worse. And then he says, and God said to me, you feed me first, and he'll feed you. And all the cynics went, well, that's convenient. Sounds like a great plan. And so, like, well, I'm going to go wash my hands, and you go ahead and make me that last loaf of bread, and don't worry, God's going to take care of you. I mean, you have to kind of stop and go, like, these were humans. These were real people living in real times. What are you thinking if you're her? What do you say? She has no guarantee that this guy's not a scam artist. She doesn't have cable TV. She doesn't know if he's on late at night, like scamming people out of their stuff. Like she doesn't know the facts about this. She doesn't know if God's behind the promise. And yet what the text tells us is she opted to go with the prophet. And he came back and he's like, okay, great, bring me the food. And she did. She went into her cupboard. She took the last bit of flour, the last bit of oil. She made bread. She brought it to him. Now, if I'm her at this point, I'm going, okay, this is like one of those tricks with Abraham and Isaac, like he was going to eat it, but then now he passed the test. He's actually going to give it to the son. No, he eats it. Shamelessly, like, oh man, you guys are starving to death? That's too bad because this is good bread. Crazy. And she turns around and she goes back to the cupboard, and the jar's got flour in it again. And the oil jar's got oil in it again. And so she makes another loaf of bread. I think takes it out to her son. He eats. Wow, Elijah didn't steal it from her. Huh, wow, you can surprise me. She goes back to the cupboard, and there's flour in the jar again. And she there's oil. She makes another loaf of bread. She takes it, she plops down, she eats. And listen, I hope you're practicing some kind of solitude silence thing in the mornings or at some part in your day, just 15 minutes. But Like, you should go read 1 Kings 17 if you're looking for something to read, because it is the most remarkable story. And what the text tells us, this is crazy. Like, this is why I say, like, this is for God followers, because this is crazy. There's no way around it. What the text tells us is that for the rest of the famine, God resupplied the food needs of the widow and her son because she was faithful on the front end and didn't hold it all back for herself. And I think what we gain is a picture that generosity, at its very core, at its very, very core, it's actually not even about the common good. That generosity at its very core is about a belief that God will resupply our needs. That God has called us to step into life and serve others at our own cost at times, but ultimately that we would learn that He's the provider of our needs. Second story is of a guy named David. King David, the mighty King David, the most famous leader of Israel, maybe the best leader of Israel, the one who in his younger years, as one person says it, was very, very meticulous about his obedience to God. Very, very precise. Part of the way the scriptures describe that is that it says that David was a man after God's own heart. And what we get reiterated to us over and over and over again in the story of David is that God's favor was all over his life. He was this nobody from kind of a nobody clan. He became a famous orator, a famous writer, a famous poet, a politician, a warrior. He was world famous, literally. And David, from the very beginning, he understood that this is all because God's favor is on my life. Whatever he touched, it, as we would say, turned to gold. And then as David got older, I guess what happened to him is what happens to me and what provoked me to talk about generosity in this series. Because over time, David's explanation, when people would say to him, like, how did you ascend to such heights? How did you get that job in the company? How did you move through it this fast? And they only moved, they've been here 10 years, twice as long as you, and they're nowhere near as far. How did that happen? And David's explanation shifted from God's favor to him. He started to say things like, man, I was at the office before anyone else was to the office. I worked harder. I was more tenacious. I stayed later. I wanted it more. I was more driven. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I was incredible. And slowly but surely what you see in the chronology and the biography of David's life is that he just began to lose sight of God's blessing on his life until one day it all culminated. There was a guy who was one of his best friends. He was also the commander of his army. And he went to his best friend, he went to this commander, and he said, hey, I want you to go count the troops. And immediately, this guy who knows him better than he knows himself in some ways says, no, David, you don't want to do that. David, I know why you want me to count the troops. You want me to count the troops so that when you hang out with all your king buddies, you can compare the size of your army to theirs. You want to hang out with all the troops because if your army is this size, there's a whole different caliber of people you can hang out with. This is about you, David. Don't do this. And he stood his ground, and he said, count them. And eventually his friend came back, and he reported to him, he said, okay, David, well, I've got the numbers for you. There's 800,000 in this army. There's 500,000 in this army. Your army's 1.3 million big. So now go off, brag to all your king buddies, join that next tier in the club, hang out with a different group of people, because you've arrived to the 1.3 million status level. And the text says, listen in 2 Samuel 24, it says, David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men. And he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I've done a very foolish thing. Immediately, David understood what he had done. Immediately, his conscience was stricken. Immediately, he could see that he had drifted in his understanding of why he was where he was. And yet 2 Samuel 24, if you struggle with the God of the Old Testament, don't read it. Because it is what follows this is crazy. The things that, David actually gets three options. Like, okay, your punishment is one of three things. Pick one. And it's like, damned if you do, damned if you don't, damned if you do. It's just, there's no good option. And at the back end of his picking one of those options, he decides that he's advised that the way to end all of this horror that's followed his terrible decision is to go make an altar. Now, in their culture, you would make an altar for one reason. You'd make an altar to build a memory of either something really amazing that God did or something really stupid that you did that you never want to do again. And so you would go and you'd buy a chunk of land, you would get rocks, you would create an animal sacrifice, you'd put all that on this altar, and the idea was, I want to create a living memory of the cost of this, because like I was going to buy a new car, now I got to buy a pile of rocks. There was this like being reinforced that your sin, that your brokenness cost you something. You had to buy an animal. You had to waste this perfectly good animal on a sacrifice. And the idea was that you and your kids and your grandkids and your family and your clan and your community would see that and they would learn from your mistake. Like, don't do that. And so David went and he went to this land and he was going to buy this chunk of land, and the landowner, who was himself wealthy, came out to David and his entourage and he says, no, you don't need to buy this. You can have it. Oh, wow, okay. And he said, in fact, I'll have my workers help build it. And as though that's not enough, here's an animal. Like, why don't you just go sacrifice this particular animal? Like, just have it. And David's response is so telling. Listen to this. But David replied, no, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. And David, in that moment, his integrity was recalibrated because what he's telling us is, I think, is that generosity at its very core, it comes with cost. And that's why I think the older you get and the more established you become and the more money you make, the easier it is to drift from generosity. Because listen, for you to pick up the tab while you're having a meal with somebody, it just doesn't cost as much maybe as it used to. For you to write that check, it just doesn't cost as much. It's why we talk so much around here about proportionate giving. That it's planned and it's because it just, do you see this? Especially those of you in your 30s and 40s and you're doing better than you ever realized you could. Like, this is where I struggled. Like, okay, so am I being generous or I just have a good budget? I'm confused. What does this look like? David reminds us, no. God doesn't want things that don't come at a cost. The third story is from Jesus' life. Jesus, he did the weirdest thing. Like, I'm awkward, and it always helps me when I read the Gospels because I think Jesus had incredible people skills, was crazy likable, neither of which do I have or am, but he also I think he was awkward, so at least I'm 1 for 3. Because he went into the temple treasury, and he did the unspeakable. He went to the temple treasury, and the place where people would offer their offerings, he just stared at it. He just watched people. Now listen, I've watched you take the offering bag, and there's just like you don't even want to look at somebody like, I don't want to see if they're putting anything in there, and if it's awkward for you, imagine what it's like for me. So not Jesus, he just like parked, and he just watched people give. I was like, hey, what's going on? I don't know. I just want to see what people are giving. And if that wasn't enough, what happened is some people called it a trumpet. They would build this metal receptacle, kind of like the thing at Vans where you drop the quarter in and it spins around, only there was no spinning thing. But the idea was that it was metal and all the money was metal. And if you lived in, say, the Galilee and you were going to the temple and you were going to bring your first fruits, you probably didn't want to saddle up your donkey with all this grain, so you would sell it and you would give the money at the temple. So what was happening by Jesus' day was that giving money to the temple became its own religious rite. Metal on metal makes noise. And so the idea became you could tell who was holy by how much noise they made. And there were these kind of gross celebrations of, wow, did you hear that? You could hear it from the other side of the temple. That was noisy. That guy's committed to God. And then this woman walked by, and it was like she just waved at the thing. You couldn't even hear. She dropped these 2 little BBs, these little tiny copper coins. And Jesus, he kind of arrested the whole moment. And he said to his guys, hey, guys, there's just something that I want you to see. It says, as Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. Truly, I tell you, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. And these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in all she had to live in. See, I think if we're looking for a picture of generosity, part of what Jesus reminds us here is God's not impressed by amounts. He's impressed by faith. To give somebody, for me to give my 10% is not nearly as costly as the poor widow to give the last of her flour. And Jesus is pointing out that, I love the way Bill Hybels said it. He said, God's not impressed by the amount. He's impressed by the faith that drives the amount. That's at the core of generosity. And you could come up with all of your own stories as to why sometimes something feels really generous and sometimes it feels really pretentious. But see, here's really where I think this goes as we analyze drifting, is aren't all of our situations the situation of the poor widow? The first one, the Elijah one? Like every time you're moved to pick up the tab at a dinner, every time you're moved to do something generous for a friend, every time the Holy Spirit calls you to do something for the poor, every time you write that tithe check, every time you do anything generous, don't you face the same situation? God, do you really have my back? God, will you really resupply? Like, God, the math doesn't add up, but does it really add up? And see, what we do in that moment, the way we answer that question, that drives our level of generosity, doesn't it? That's what determines, do we live with a sense of scarcity, or the sense that God is behind it all and he rewards faithfulness, and not always in monetary ways? Bill Hybels had this illustration that I think is the best I've ever heard as we talk about these things. It involves two people who can hear the exact same message. She's got bad hips. So we've got a man, last time he did too, but this time I'm 1 for 2, only one person with bad hips. I hear that's painful. So they can both hear the same message, right? And so he says, in order to get from A to B financially, in order to get from where I am to having a retirement, to having a house, to putting my kids through college or help my kids through college, in order to accomplish the things I want financially, I need 100% of what I have. And yet, someone else, and sometimes these two people exist inside the same marriage, they go, no. In order for me to get from A to B, I need 90. In fact, this person would say, there's something even better than B. There's C. And C doesn't mean more money. C means more favor from God, and never confuse the two. But I think that I can get from A to C, and the way to do that is with less. Now, here's what's fascinating. Even if you don't follow Jesus, you can read the Harvard Journal talking about how what they're starting to understand now is even from a completely secular standpoint. Teresa talked about this in February, that to use all of your time for yourself or to use all of your money for yourself is actually a terrible strategy for contentment. But I said we're not going to dive into it from the non-God follower standpoint, so let's just stay there. See, he says I need 100, she says I need 90, and she says I can get beyond B, I can get to C. But here's the catch. Both of them think the other one is an absolute idiot, right? I mean, he looks at her, and he's like, oh my word, you've drank the Kool-Aid. Like, I can't believe you bought into all that preacher talk. Like, you've been watching too much late night TV. You've confused the American church tradition for what God really meant by generosity. He can come up with all kinds of explanations for like, no. You've bought a lie. No. And yet she says the exact same thing, doesn't she? You're an idiot. I can't believe that you think that the best way to live is for you to use all of it on yourself. I can't believe that you've sat in church and listened to all those sermons and you've still concluded that B is better than C. You're an idiot. You're just an idiot. And so my question to you, I guess this morning is, like, what kind of idiot do you want to be? Because by this whole deal, like, someone's an idiot. Someone is. And see, here's where I think the scriptures to provoke us to think about, like, what kind of idiot are you going to be? What kind of priorities are you going to live with? Here's the thing. Some of you are right smack in the middle of C right now. And you don't even know how to tell your stories because you feel like one of those 1-800-big-hair preachers, like, it gets awkward. But ever since you made a decision to, like, live on less, you've never looked back. And again, C never means more money. It means God's favor. And early in marriage, some of you, like, you were doing the A to B equals I need 100%, and it just was a wreck. And then at some point you shifted to the 90, and maybe even you shifted to 80 because you're saving some, and maybe even you shifted to going down 1% every year, whatever. And you just tell your friends, you don't even know how to do it without sounding weird, but you just go like, dude, I can't graph it. I can't make it work in a mathematical formula. It's just better. Here's, I guess, for you, where I hopefully have something that provokes some thought in you. See, the challenge is drifting. And what we see over and over and over in the scriptures is we are really prone to thinking that past deposits will guarantee future rewards. It's really easy to think I'm in C now and I can get really sloppy and I can drift away from generosity and I'll still have C later. And this is so at the core of what Paul in the New Testament was helping these group of people called the Corinthians with. They had experienced God's movement in their community so powerfully, saved them from these crazy environments. And then they were starting to get sloppy and they were starting, frankly, to do whatever the heck they wanted to do. And Paul wrote to them and he goes, hey, let me remind you of Israel. Remember how Israel experienced God? Remember how Israel saved them from slavery? Remember how Israel parted the Red Sea? Remember how God was so present with them that there was a cloud over their head that just kind of told them where to go? And we all go like, I could use the cloud, Lord. Remember that? Listen to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10. I'm working my way kind of methodically through it, and I read that this week, and I went, oh my word, this is drift. 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says, for I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. That God's presence was so apparent in their life is what he's saying. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, the manna, right? For they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. See, what he's saying is they experienced God so powerfully, and then they got flippant, and they thought they had God's favor canned. And what happened was their future got bleak. And Paul finishes that whole thought by saying, now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Listen, if you're in the middle of C right now, I guess the challenge that I have for you is, okay, but like being in the C now is the fruit of decisions you made back then. What decisions are you making today? Because that'll determine what your future looks like. And for those of you, some of you, I know I've been here. You can remember a time where you were in C and you're not anymore and you're mad at God. And I guess I'm hoping that maybe you'll start to see it's not God's fault. You're responsible for you. You changed the course and you're reaping what you've sown and you don't like it. And yet God says, no, you can right the ship. Stop living for yourself. Stop thinking you need all your time and all your energy and all your resource, and stop thinking you're the only one with a busy job. Stop thinking you're the only one with a busy family life. We all have it. That's what makes generosity challenging. It's hard because we don't have any extra. None of us. And some of you, you're on the sidelines, and again, we so respect you. We're not trying to force you off the sidelines. I'm not in any way trying to look down upon you. But I guess I feel like this is a really clear glimpse as to what it would mean to get off the sidelines. I mean, did Jesus die on the cross for our sins? Yes. Was the tomb empty? Yes. Is it important that we understand that Jesus is for those of us who can't live up to our commitments to God for how we're going to live? Yes. And in the everyday practical level, what it looks like is choosing that one set of math works way better than the other. That to walk with God, it's about way more than a bumper sticker, and it's about way more than a political platform, and it's about way more of any number of things we make it, that it's about living in the daily awareness that we follow a God who resupplies. And as one of my friends says it, we have to operate without a safety net that reminds us that God is the safety net. That God doesn't want our stuff for stuff's sake, he wants our faith. That God knows the condition of our hearts when we give. For you, as you just continue to contemplate faith, please know you're not contemplating political party. You're not contemplating like drink, don't drink, all that stuff. What you're contemplating is it all up to you? Or is there divine help and favor found in the forgiveness and grace of Jesus? That's the decision you're making. Listen, I don't know how this lands for you, but I hope that it provokes you to think a little bit about where you're at. Because as Paul said to Timothy, Paul didn't call the early churches to be givers. He called them to be generous. Guys like me, places like this, we're so good at talking about giving. Well, I'm not, but others are. But that's a false win. The win is generosity. So let me just finish here. Listen, if you're ready, If you're going like, hey, I am ready to step off the plank. I am ready to step into dependence upon the living God. I'm ready to believe. Listen, that involves grace. Because what makes a Christian, I heard this week and I just love it. What makes the gospel is the belief that the commitments that we make to God about how we're going to live, we can't live up to. And God closes that gap for us. And so there's lots of things you can do. You can raise your hand, you can sign a card, there's lots of things, but ultimately it comes down to communicating to God, God, I'm yours, and I want to follow you. And listen, I don't think you can do that alone. So tell me, tell the person you're with, tell somebody. But if you're really going to change the direction of your life, if you're really going to walk with God, it's going to have to become a part of your relationships and your conversations.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.